Gin Blossoms rose to prominence in the early 90s thanks to their second record, New Miserable Experience, which was a multi-platinum success. But it was a miracle that the band even released the record. To add insult to injury, they had to film 3 different videos for their breakout single because MTV just wasn't interested. And even as the band started to catch on and were enjoying their newfound fame, their ex-band leader and principal songwriter soon watched everything from afar. Humiliated, angry, and hopeless, things ended badly for him. His demise continued to haunt the band to this day. Today, let's talk about the darkness that accompanied Gin Blossom's breakout success. Hailing from Tempe, Arizona, Gin Blossoms were born and raised on R.E.M., Tom Petty, Cheap Trick, and The Replacements. The LA Times wrote in 1993 during a piece on the band, "Let's face it, Tempe, Arizona is not exactly a thriving rock and roll mecca. It seems like one of those places that a budding rock band leaves then later reminisces about for its boring but lovable qualities." The group's musical interest stood in sharp contrast to the popular alternative and grunge groups of the day who were fed a healthy diet of punk rock, metal, and bands like Pixies. Unlike grunge and alternative rock, Gin Blossoms married joyful-sounding melodies with young adult anxieties. They were hard to categorize, but MTV and radio programmers came to love the group. I still hear a handful of their tunes from their second and third records on the radio where I live. Working at a Tower Records store in Tempe were frontman Robin Wilson and bassist Bill Leen. Wilson admitted that working at Tower Records exposed him to so many different types of music, as he was initially into U2, Depeche Mode, and Simple Minds, but as time went on, he got more into groups like The Replacements and R.E.M. But interestingly enough, Wilson didn't initially play in the first incarnation of Gin Blossoms, as the band underwent some lineup changes early on in their career. Gin Blossoms were formed in 1987 by Leen and guitarist Doug Hopkins. Hopkins' life was full of contrasts. He was well-read, an amazing songwriter, scribbling lyrics on napkins, and a shy guy who read poetry to his girlfriend before bed. But at the same time, he was a depressed alcoholic insomniac. Born in Seattle, Hopkins grew up in Tempe after his family relocated there. He split his time between skateboarding and, of course, playing music. In high school, he played in several bands, and he also did the same in college. He crafted songs about his life, circumstances that were sometimes sad, and he was able to make them into poppy, radio-friendly tunes. Hopkins and Leen were classmates at Tempe's McClintock High School. They were both outcasts. For Hopkins, he turned to music, learning guitar, and he went on to study music at a local community college before attending Arizona State University to study sociology. He graduated from ASU in 1985. He remarked how his sociology degree allowed him to work at a gas station. It was Leen, though, who introduced Hopkins to punk rock, with the pair playing together in a series of groups throughout the early part of the 80s, including a new wave outfit called Psalms. Hopkins was even interviewed by a local journalist at the time, remarking, "I like pop songs, but without the typical arrangement. I try to stay away from the obvious or what you might expect the song to do." The pair temporarily relocated to Portland, Oregon before returning to Tempe and meeting Jesse Valenzuela. Valenzuela had skateboarded with Hopkins and had a few stops and starts with the duo, as he also enlisted in the Navy for a period of time. The early incarnation of Gin Blossoms even had Valenzuela playing rhythm guitar and fronting the group. They went through a few different drummers, with one of them even convincing Valenzuela to quit his day job to solely focus on music, something he agreed to do. Now, you're probably wondering about the name Gin Blossoms. The name Gin Blossoms was the brainchild of Bill Leen. The group's eventual drummer Philip Rhodes told the Orlando Sentinel the name came from a book called Hollywood Babylon that had a picture of W.C. Fields with a caption that read, "His nose was all red from drinking too much hard stuff," and they called the burst capillaries Gin Blossoms. The band joked that so many of their songs were written about alcohol because they played so many bars in the early days. They even came up with an alter ego called Del Monte's to keep the gigs coming and for the free booze to keep flowing. They most famously did TV themes in the Del Montes, including the Jeffersons Moving On Up. But Gin Blossoms in their early days had a rhythm guitar player who had a serious drug problem, so he was booted from the group. By this point, Wilson switched jobs and he was now working at A&M Records, and he was also studying planetary science at a local community college. His friend Leen was still working at Tower Records, and one day called up Wilson to see if he wanted to audition for the group, something he agreed to do, and he got the gig as the group's new rhythm guitarist. A couple months soon went by, and Wilson and Valenzuela switched roles, as Wilson admitted he was probably in over his head playing guitar and wanted to front a group instead. He even credited Valenzuela for not having an ego, agreeing to switch spots. Gin Blossoms soon solidified their lineup with drummer Philip Rhodes. With their lineup in tow, the group became the house band for the Tempe club Long Longs, which was set to be the center of the city's music scene. The group played booze-soaked sets on Friday and Saturday nights, with booker Saracena telling Phoenix magazine, so by the end of the night, there were all kinds of crazy things. Robin and Doug would do chicken fights, and Robin would jump up on top of Doug, and people in the audience would do the same thing, and they'd have chicken fights while Doug's playing guitar and Robin singing. Things got so rowdy that Doug and Jesse even punched holes in the ceiling of the club with their guitars. It was at Long Wong's that Hopkins met a waitress named Sandra Quijas, and the two started dating. Hopkins' penchant for music was only surpassed by his drinking, with her telling Phoenix magazine Times he could go out any night of the week broke and come home drunk. But he was too smart and too funny for me to ever stay mad at him. In those early days, Hopkins wrote most of the songs with Valenzuela. Wilson was also penning songs, but he admitted in several interviews that Hopkins just didn't have the patience to hear his tunes a lot of the time. Wilson later admitted it wasn't until he penned the tune Allison Road that his band members started to take him more seriously. Gin Blossoms soon graduated to playing shows around Tempe, at frat parties for students at the Arizona State University, and at local bars. In 1988, the band was chosen by the Phoenix New-Times as the best band from Phoenix, and they also were picked to represent the city at South by Southwest the following year. One organization that recruited Gin Blossoms around this time was the ASCAP, or the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers. The organization brought the band to LA to play a showcase of artists at the Coconut Teaser Club. It was while in LA, Gin Blossoms started getting gigs at other local hotspots like Raji's and Club Lingerie. So throughout '89 and 1990, they drove to Hollywood once a month to do gigs. Before Gin Blossoms played South by Southwest, Wilson opted to drop out of junior college, and when he told his father, who was an accounting professor who also hated rock music, his response to his son was, "You're a idiot." Well, we'll come back to his dad later on in the story. Gin Blossoms recorded their debut LP, Dusted, in 1989 on a local Tucson label named San Jacinto. The band got help from a local woman named Laura Leland, who negotiated the deal and even put up her own money to record the album. On that first LP was Hey Jealousy and Found Out About You, which would later go on to be some of the band's biggest hits. Albeit, I want to point out they were in a much different state than what ended up on their first major label release 3 years later. The album in general has a faster tempo, sounding more like the Replacements, and it was less polished than their subsequent releases. So Hopkins had written Hey Jealousy and brought it to the band 4 days before they were set to go record Dusted. Hopkins could sing, but he was so embarrassed about his voice, he took Wilson to a bathroom at the rehearsal studio to play the song to him. He had a few lines he couldn't finish, so he got Wilson to fill in the blanks. Hopkins wrote the song about his ex, hoping to reconcile with her. Meanwhile, the song Found Out About You also deals with the same relationship. In addition to playing South by Southwest, Gin Blossoms also appeared at a college music award show, which was also broadcast on MTV, sharing the stage with Lou Reed and Red Hot Chili Peppers. Gin Blossoms were the only unsigned act at the award show, so of course record labels took notice.
Tonight, the featured band hails, still unsigned, so heads up you jaded suits. From Arizona, the Gin Blossoms.
Having an album in Dusted also allowed the group to have a product to shop around to major labels. It was by early 1990, the band was being courted by major labels, eventually signing with A&M. Fun fact you guys may not know is that the guy who signed Gin Blossoms from A&M also signed Soundgarden and Extreme. Gin Blossom signed with A&M in May of 1990, and the plan was to go out to LA to record their major label debut. While the band should have been celebrating, guitarist Doug Hopkins was not. Having suffered from severe depression from a young age, he was against signing with a major label, feeling pressure to deliver, and he didn't want to be beholden to someone else, especially a major corporate overlord. His drinking only escalated when the band signed with A&M, and according to Rolling Stone magazine, he frequently showed up intoxicated to gigs, while band practices soon turned into screaming matches. Even though Robin Wilson was the frontman of the group and the biggest star in the band, in his book, it was Hopkins who was the real star of the group, recalling to the Phoenix New Times. He was tall, really handsome, he just had this presence and charisma to him. On stage, he was like Angus Young in AC/DC, a lot of jumping and a lot of kicks, and grabbing the mic stand and doing the Pete Townsend thing. Early on in the band's history, Wilson and Hopkins were largely inseparable. They'd skateboard together, see movies together, hang out, and even drive to gigs together. But the relationship soon changed, with Wilson adding, "As soon as we got signed, the worm turned." Gin Blossom started to work with Albie Galutin in Los Angeles, who famously produced the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack, Barry Gibb, Barbra Streisand, as well as Jellyfish. But it wasn't meant to be. Wilson claimed there was a lot of personality conflicts, adding to the Phoenix New Times. To me, the Albie Galutin sessions were like when you're a little kid and you go to Lou Brock baseball camp. Maybe it's not the only way to play baseball, but you still learn a lot. The sessions saw the band spending upwards of $100,000 with nothing to show for it. The band were convinced that they were going to be dropped by their label, but surprisingly, when they talked to their A&R guy, he was pretty understanding, telling them that stuff like this happens all the time. Wilson added that back in those days, labels wanted to nurture artists and build careers and not necessarily make a quick buck off bands. So Gin Blossoms convinced the label to let them record and self-produce a 5-song EP, something A&M agreed to. This resulted in the 5-song EP Up and Crumbling that came out on October 8th, 1991. The EP proved to be enough of a success, selling around 20,000 copies, with it eventually being played on radio stations in Chicago, Denver, and Washington, D.C. The next part of A&M's plan was to get Gin Blossoms on the road to see if they could survive a grueling winter tour across the states. The label gave the musicians half of the money of what they needed to tour, and they ended up playing 30 or so shows. The ensuing tour, nicknamed by the band the Please God Don't Let Us See Our Ex-Girlfriends tour, saw Gin Blossoms grow tighter as a unit. After returning from the road in early 1992, A&M insisted they use producer John Hampton, who was involved in their Up and Crumbling EP. Because the producer's wife was pregnant at the time, he couldn't travel, so Gin Blossoms traveled to his place of residence, Memphis, to Ardent Studios to cut the album in February of '92. Apart from indulging in Memphis barbecue, they also got some help from the city's musicians. CJ Chenier played accordion on the Cajun song. They had also written a country parody song called Cheating, but after getting Waylon Jennings' pedal steel player Robbie Turner to help out, it turned out so well it became the album's closing number.
Call it cheating, she reminds me of you.
That's not to say the experience was perfect, because it was anything but. The band soon ran into problems with Hopkins. Wilson told the LA Times in 1996, "It's just a sad thing when you've got somebody you love and you're just watching them destroy themselves before your eyes and there's nothing you can do to stop it. And it's all happening while you're making the most important record you've ever made in your life." At one point, Hopkins left the sessions for a week, but he got arrested at the airport for public intoxication. Wilson remarked that being in a band with Doug was like having a big anvil attached to you at all times, adding, "He made everything such a pain." Wilson even remembered one incident that showed how checked out Doug was, recalling, "I came into the studio and Doug was in there with John, and I heard John say, 'Well, someone is going to have to do these guitar solos.' Doug said, 'I guess I'd rather Jesse do my solos.' I was just floored. I could not believe that was something that Doug was considering. He was giving up. I left the room and almost threw up." The story goes that Hopkins left the recording sessions early, passing out and missing his flight back home. On the second try, the group's engineer doused the guitarist in mouthwash and aftershave to hide his smell and escort him on the flight. Hopkins ended up disputing the version of events his bandmates painted, claiming he was too incapacitated in the studio. Following Hopkins' exit from the group, they contemplated what to do next. Should they change their name and not even use his songs? But A&M broke the news to the band that Hopkins' song Hey Jealousy was going to be the first single from the album. Wilson had even brought up the idea of giving Hopkins one more chance, but his bandmates were weary. They even considered having an arrangement where Hopkins wouldn't tour with them, but he would help the band write songs. But it was reported that it was the group's label A&M who finally put their foot down and told the band that Hopkins had to go. A&M publicist Rick Gershon added to Magna magazine, they became a completely different band to be around once they were separated from Doug, much more upbeat. After Hopkins' departure, the band shrunk to a quartet with Wilson doing vocals and rhythm guitar. But after a few rehearsals, the band decided that they should get a fifth member, and they soon enlisted guitarist Scott Johnson, who the band members knew from a group who was also from Tempe. Actually, in an interesting twist, Johnson's previous band, the Feedbags, shared a rehearsal space with Gin Blossoms in their early days, and he witnessed Gin Blossoms' debut performance on Christmas in 1987. As for the title New Miserable Experience and whether it was autobiographical, Wilson stated that it simply describes the process of being in a band. New Miserable Experience saw an August 92 release, and initially it wasn't a big success. The record was sent to Album Rock and Alternative Radio a month before its release, and the first single, Hey Jealousy, died immediately on radio. Only a handful of modern rock stations added the tune. Then the label switched to releasing the second single, and then a third single in Mrs. Rita. By the way, there actually is a Mrs. Rita, Rita Miller. She's a fortune teller from Arizona. She had a place next to Wilson's former place of employment, Zia Records, and she spoke to the Arizona Republic about the song and said she was proud to be forever immortalized in it. Just as the label released Mrs. Rita, a handful of stations in the States started playing Hey Jealousy. So by February of '93, the band started their own headlining tour for 4 months, including playing free noontime shows at select universities where A&M's street team handed out a 4-song sampler. Then later that night, the band played at local clubs. Meanwhile, on the West Coast, in January of 1993, LA station K-Rock started playing Hey Jealousy. It was only added to the station after Kevin Weatherly heard the song on pirate radio. He told Billboard, "It just became an enormous success for us. We couldn't get rid of it. 6 months later, it's still in solid rotation." Within its first year of release, the album sold around 80,000 copies. Then things finally changed, as Wilson told the LA Times. Then the label and our manager got together and decided it was a much better record than that, and they came up with a strategy to relaunch the record with a new cover and a new video. The single Hey Jealousy had to be relaunched not once, not twice, but 3 times. The budget for the first video was around $5,000, the second was $10,000, and the third was $40,000. The second video was apparently rejected by MTV because it was black and white, and the network told the band they didn't want a black and white video. Then MTV did its magic and the song exploded. New Miserable Experience finally entered the Billboard 200 charts by May of '93. Soon enough, other singles would follow, including the Hopkins penned tune Found Out About You. Hey Jealousy and Found Out About You both peaked at number 25 on the Hot 100 chart and were both top 5 hits on the mainstream rock tracks chart. The success of these 2 songs meant that Gin Blossoms were forever playing in the shadow of their former bandmate Doug Hopkins. Hey, jealousy. Hey, jealousy. Billboard magazine published an article in 1994, 18 months after Hey Jealousy became a huge hit, writing how the song should have burned out by now, but it was still a staple of modern and album rock, as well as top 40 stations, with the magazine calling it, and I quote, a stubborn hit. Even top 40 station Z100 by 1994 was spinning the song 30 to 50 times a week, and VH1 was still giving the video a lot of screen time. A spokesman for Z100 told Billboard the song has no burn factor, adding that they had yet to receive any negative feedback on the song. Gin Blossom soon saw many comparisons to the Byrds, the Replacements, and REM, with Wilson telling an interviewer, "We're not trying to be some stoic artist trying to do something completely different. There's hardly anything unique in music anymore." And this was something that critics held against the band. One reviewer remarked, "I thought they banned music in Arizona after Alice Cooper hit it big," while others criticized the band for not being very original. The timing of New Miserable Experience taking off seemed perfect, as by the summer of '93, music fans were inundated with an onslaught of grunge and alternative rock artists. Their record label A&M told the LA Times not all the young kids belong to that style of music or are represented by the angst of that message. There are other kids who see life a little bit simpler. It's not kids who don't see a future. The Gin Blossoms are a little more uplifting, and I think they strike a chord with those kids. As for their ex-bandmate Hopkins, he was forced to see Gin Blossom's success from afar, and he was soon dealing with the band's hardball business tactics. Rolling Stone reported that the band withheld $15,000 of Hopkins' royalties until he agreed to sign away half of his publishing. The guitarist reluctantly agreed since he needed the money, and the half that he signed away was then transferred to his replacement. By 1993, Hopkins and his girlfriend were in dire financial straits, mostly living off her tips, while he was playing in several local Tucson bands, including the Chimeras. While they did get some local interest and some positive reviews, his self-destructive behavior soon derailed them. Once Hey Jealousy became a monster hit, Hopkins received a gold record for the song, something he held up in his apartment for 2 weeks before he destroyed it. Hopkins also blasted his former band in the press, remarking, "The great days of that band are gone. I've seen him since, and frankly, they're a yawn fest. I spent 5 years of my life trying to make Gin Blossoms mean something cool, and now I have to see the version parading around." At a hometown Gin Blossoms gig in October of '93, Hopkins showed up unannounced and punched Wilson in the face in front of the crowd. Then on December 4th, 1993, Hopkins entered a Phoenix area hospital where he would do an initial consultation in an attempt to get sober. It was one of many attempts to stop drinking, with his longest stretch being about 2 weeks. The next day, the guitarist sadly was found dead in his apartment. He was only 32 and was found with $500 in his pocket. The same month that Hopkins died, New Miserable Experience moved into the top 25 on the Billboard album chart. According to People magazine, at the guitarist's memorial service, his former bandmates were approached by a woman bearing what she said was a message from Hopkins. She asked them whether they remembered someone pouring sugar into their gas tank of their tour van back in 1992, while the woman said Hopkins had instructed her to tell them that he was the culprit. Wilson smiled at the news, recalling, "Hearing that at the funeral sort of made me feel good. Doug was always good at getting the last laugh, that's for sure." After the funeral, the band continued to tour and the hits kept coming. The song Until I Fall Away peaked at number 21 on the Hot 100 airplay chart and number 40 on the mainstream rock tracks chart. Mrs. Rita peaked at number 36 on the mainstream rock tracks chart, while Allison Road also made an appearance on the mainstream rock tracks chart. New Miserable Experience ended up going 4 times platinum in the States and was a massive success. Soon enough, even Wilson's dad, who I talked about earlier, was convinced of his son's choice, with Wilson recalling, "I called him once backstage from Los Angeles at the Greek Theater. 'Dad, our record just went gold.' And there's this long pause and he goes, 'Well, Robin, I feel like an idiot.'" Then fast forward to 1995 and Gin Blossoms continue their role. They appear on the Empire Records soundtrack with Till I Hear It From You, which was written by the band and the outside songwriter Marshall Crenshaw. It ended up being a top 5 hit on the mainstream rock tracks chart. Till I hear it from you. While New Miserable Experience was a huge success in America, that wasn't the case overseas in Europe. By this point, the band was exhausted and didn't even bother chasing sales outside of North America. On top of all this, tensions in the band were at an all-time high. A rift had grown between Wilson and Valenzuela. A&M publicist Rick Gershon told Magna Magazine, Robin really thought he was a rock star. Then you have Jesse, who really wasn't built for this kind of life. He's a homebody. Couple this with every interview bringing up Doug Hopkins' shadow, looming over the band, and questioning whether they could continue to have success, and something had to give. As the group worked on their follow-up LP, things finally boiled over. Producer John Hampton was once again brought up to work on their follow-up record, telling Magna Magazine they hated each other. That's why a lot of the writing on the second album was so lacking. The band, not wanting to imply they needed outside songwriters, opted not to release Till I Hear It From You on their follow-up album, 1996's Congratulations, I'm Sorry, an album whose title was a reference to their departed bandmate Doug Hopkins. The album did result in 2 more hit songs, Follow You Down and As Long As It Matters, but it didn't match the success of New Miserable Experience.
Anywhere you go, I'll follow you down.
Then in 1997, Gin Blossoms called it quits before reconvening in the new millennium, a story I can probably cover another time. Then in 2021, it was reported that a movie was being done about Doug Hopkins, but there seems to be no update on it, as it still appears to be in pre-production. Well, that does it for today's video, guys. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again on Rock and Roll True Stories. Take care.